Our subject today, being attunement, is a very appropriate one for the time of the 4th of July, which is the time of independence and freedom. Especially there's an interesting corollary between independence and attunement, which may seem like opposites, but in fact really come together in a higher reality than we can see. It's an astonishing experience to live in this world. I'm sure all of you have noticed that too. We just find ourselves here living through this extraordinary variety of conditions and circumstances, which is human life. And many people just live what you would have to call an unexamined life. It's just whatever is given to them is what they do, and that's sort of the story that they live out. And it never crosses their mind to really ask fundamental questions. It's more like, once we're here in this body, how do we make this, above all, a pleasurable experience? Swami Kriyananda once remarked that the nature of this particular planet is it's a very pleasure-oriented planet. It's not a service-oriented planet or a suffering-oriented planet. It's very much about pleasure. We are in what's called Rajoguna, which is the ego-activating quality. That's the characteristic quality of this earth, ego-activating. I find myself as an individual, and we identify with our bodies without even stopping to think for a minute that there is any other alternative to that. We don't really think I, as something separate from my body, have identified with my body. We just, well, this is who we are. Reality is me, and this is what I am. This is why the saints teach us to have a devotional relationship to God, even though philosophically we can bring it to the point where we say, well, God is everything, God is in me, God is everywhere, I am the divine. But if we say, I am God, what we subconsciously and deeply mean by that word I attaches itself to the individualized spirit identified with the body. So clearly this body and I living in it, limited by it, clearly do not manifest the characteristics of the infinite. I mean, all we are conscious of, as I was saying in here a few weeks ago, is what we can see and experience through the senses. If there's something physically wrong with your eyes, you can't even see anymore. If you grow older and become impaired in your hearing, you can't hear anymore. But the infinite spirit is not limited by any of these tiny transitory conditions, and yet that which I call I is very much limited by those conditions. Or is it? And that begins the progress of spiritual life, is beginning to ask, to beginning to live what we would call an examined life, which is, why am I really here? And what am I really doing? When I was a young child, I had what I can only call now, excuse me a moment, I would say a karmic memory of having been a yogi in a previous incarnation. In the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna says, what happens to me, Krishna, if I make this supreme effort to realize God, and despite my best efforts, I don't fully succeed? Well, Krishna says, when you're born in the next incarnation, you basically start where you left off. Your consciousness continues unchanged, even though your body is discarded. You spend time in the astral world, and then you reincarnate in a physical body. The vibration where you choose to reincarnate, in terms of consciousness, is where you came from. It may be a different gender, it may be a different culture, a different time, different yuga, different planet. But the vibration of consciousness is going to be exactly the same, because that's all that we ever have. And when I was a child, I always had this sort of sense of just that there was so much more going on this planet, but I was bewildered by the fact that nobody ever talked to me about it. We were, a typical family, Jewish in our heritage, not particularly religious in our practice. My parents were intellectual, they were very ethical, they raised us to be honorable, but they never actually answered the fundamental question, which is, hey, Daddy, why are we here? When I asked my parents, how did we get here? Why are we here? They would just be like, no comprehension of that question. It wasn't a question you could really ask. In this context, I remember once trying to figure out why we were Jews and not Christians and what Jews were. I asked my father quite seriously when I was about 10, why, now explain to me, like, why isn't Jesus the Messiah? That was like so fundamental to being Jewish. I figured he knew the answer. So like, explain to me why he isn't the Messiah. Everybody else thinks he is. We're still waiting. Like, what is this about? My poor father. He was a brilliant man in many ways, but he was just totally at sea. You know, this poor little kid, you know, staring up at him at that moment that parents get into, where you wish to be anywhere else but there. And I watched him just sort of flail around for a little while, and then I delicately changed the subject. So I could see, because he didn't have an answer. What other answers could he have for me? And I was always at a great frustration, because what people asked of me, I could easily do in school, and you know, I was a relatively self-controlled person, all of those things. But what I was really interested in, nobody was asking, and I could tell they couldn't answer me at all. And I recall staring out the window with such intensity, looking at my neighbor mowing his lawn. You know, the house we lived in, I was 9 years old at that time, watching him mow his lawn, as if by just the intensity of my gaze, I could penetrate behind it. You see, this is, you know, the reincarnational memory of having spent lifetimes, I'm sure, doing very much what I'm doing now, which is asking the real questions and trying to get real answers, and then somehow in the confusion of losing your body, being in the outer world and coming back, a subconscious lingering is there. I'm sure all of you can relate to that. Some kind of subconscious lingering, but not yet able to bring it into any kind of a clear focus, and strongly inhibited in the ability to give it a clear focus by the fact of what's going on around you. You know, be in the first grade, be in the second grade, be in the fourth grade, do your science project, get your grades in order, go to college, get a good job, then you'll be happy. Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Isn't there something else going on? And it was really quite startling to me to gradually come to understand. I thought they were keeping it a secret from me. I thought it was like, well, at a certain age, you know, maybe if I had a bat mitzvah or something, somebody would then tell me. But I watched my brother get a bat mitzvah, and nobody told him, a bar mitzvah, nobody told him. I could see it wasn't going to happen then. You know, it wasn't in the Hebrew script, and my dad didn't even know why Jesus wasn't the Messiah. You know, it was just so confusing. I really felt, in retrospect, that it was like life was going on here, and I was standing on the side, just watching it, like by the edge of a river. Because I really didn't want to get in. You know, I just didn't want to get in that river because I didn't know where that current was going to take me. Don't you all understand that? I finally made it to Stanford University. I sort of got in by accident. Then you could have personal interviews. You know, it was before it was also whatever it is now. So I was able to go up there and talk to them, and pretty much I can talk my way into anything. So I talked my way into Stanford, and I think my parents were so proud that I got in that they paid to have me go. I was, of course, going to go to college, but it was just still this, like, why? And I got to Stanford, and you know, with all due respect to those of you who attend there, it was like, here we are, the most prestigious university in the universe, virtually, or at least so they think. And there I was. And, well, to be perfectly frank with you, one of my married professors tried to have an affair with me. Like about the first, maybe that happened about 10 days after I got there. And I wasn't like, what would I say? I wasn't outraged. I wasn't shocked at immorality. I was stunned that somebody who was a professor at Stanford could be so stupid, and you're supposed to be teaching me? You know, your life is obviously such a mess, and you haven't a clue, and you're supposed to be my professor? Are you out of your mind? So I flunked out. You know, it was like, why? I made A's and F's, and the balance went toward F's at the end, you know? Because I wanted something, and I knew it was out there, and I could tell these people weren't going to teach it to me. Now, whatever your history, wherever you go, I obviously was an extreme person with this determination. You know, shortly after I dropped out of school, somebody handed me a book by Swami Vivekananda with the teaching of self-realization in it. For the first time, look, somebody's actually talking about the meaning of life, the purpose of life. Where do we come from? And how do we avoid suffering and find bliss? Duh! Isn't this what we're all here for? Isn't this what this whole thing is about? Now, nobody can hurry that process for anybody on the planet. You know, throughout all of creation, all of us just have to work our way step by step through some perception, piece by piece, of why I'm here and what I should do about it. And in the culture that we live in, really on the planet that we live in now, it's like very few people actually know. There's this wonderful movement of energy toward greater awareness because the planet is shifting a little bit. But nonetheless, this is now, always has been, and forever shall be, completely a matter of individual consciousness. And what we perceive is always and only what we're capable of perceiving. This whole universe is made of the Om vibration. That's why when we hear music of a certain kind, you know, music has a capacity to penetrate into our being in a unique and marvelous way. And music that has a really deep and beautiful vibration, the chants that Ishani was singing, that beautiful song that the choir sang for us, something happens when those vibrations move within us that are extraordinary, which is why we put ourselves again and again in the company, in the presence of those kind of vibrations, because when those vibrations come into us, our own vibration begins to harmonize with that reality. Now, at all times on this planet, all levels of reality are taking place at the same time. Right now on this planet, there are people hungry, starving, being tortured, suffering in terrible ways. There are saints and masters who are looking even at all of that reality, and all they're perceiving and feeling in it is the state of bliss that's behind it. Even in those that are suffering, they see that there is a divine potentiality that through this hardship is going to be awakened. These are very hard and difficult teachings to embrace with your whole heart when they're first presented to us. But slowly, and sometimes with great rapidity if we're extremely eager to have it happen, something happens within us, and we simply begin to perceive a reality that we didn't know was there. And once we perceive it, once it becomes a part of our inner nature, we can never look back. You know, as a young child, just growing up as a basic American kid, I would watch the people around me embrace with this wild commitment things that seemed so trivial to me. I just couldn't bear it. Just speaking, when I was 16 years old, I talked my way into it was really just a job in a very nice department store there, but they made a big deal out of us high school employees, and it was like they called us young careerists, and we got to wear these little special clothes, and I talked my way into it, and seemed to be, pretty classy at doing this, so they gave me what they considered the plum position, which was selling junior fashions to kids my own age, which was absolutely the worst place in the world to put me, because the last thing in the world I was really committed to was these flash-in-the-pan, ugly fashions that my peers were stupid enough to spend all this money on. So it was a absolute total disaster in that department. And they were really thinking they'd made a horrible mistake and were considering letting me go. And then they moved me into sheets and towels. Now, here's something I can give my heart to, sheets and towels. And then I just started doing just fine, because it was a reality I could see, and it was something I would give myself to. My teenage friends, getting all tied up in knots about these trivial things was just not anything I could give my heart to. We see what we see. We understand what we understand. But at a certain point, that determination to understand on a deeper level rises from the subconscious to the conscious level. And we answer enough questions. And first of all, what we begin to experience is that even though I live in this body, even though this body that I carry around seems to define who I am, we begin to recognize that within this body, what I'm really experiencing is my consciousness. Because think about it, when I was a 9-year-old child looking out my window, the body that I was wearing looked extremely different than this. For a long time, just for fun, I used to keep a self-portrait up on my wall in my office, and it was a picture of me at about 7 months. And there were these giant eyes like little children have, the babies have, these giant eyes and pretty big ears, just sort of looking out. But inside of that, I could feel this, just ready to go kind of energy. But all I had was that little body, so all of that intensity was coming out through my eyes. The consciousness was the same. It had to work its way through the process and get big enough to be able to read Vivekananda. But nonetheless, it was the same consciousness all the way through. And what we begin to notice when we begin to examine our lives and not just let ourselves be tumbled about and then surprise, surprise, wake up dead and then in the astral world again, find ourselves dead and then in the astral world again, we start asking, what am I really experiencing? And am I enjoying this? Are we having any fun? Is there anything that can be done about it? And we begin to recognize that no matter what the outward circumstance, all I ever experience is my consciousness within it. I'm sure all of you have experienced what I experienced, how wildly varied just even one day can be. You're exhausted, you think you can't do any work, you suddenly get slightly interested in what you're doing, hours pass and you've had a marvelous creative experience, then someone calls and says something extremely unkind to you, and then you're flat on your back again, wondering, whether it's worth it or not, and just it goes up and down, and then you get a letter in the mail telling you that, you're just absolutely the bee's knees, and isn't it marvelous, and aren't we fortunate to have you on this planet, just before the next person calls and tells you what a moron you are. I had this wonderful friend, I'll call him a friend because he was, this wonderful friend came to me once, and he said, he just sort of looked at me like this, like I hate to be the one to break the news, but somebody has to. A lot of people find you inspiring, but I don't at all. He said like that. My first response was such compassion. Oh, you poor man. And I said, you live here and I talk all the time. It must be terrible for you. It's like, what can you say? Everybody has their own reality, and I'm not pretending. This is a job. I do it. I'm grateful if people want to come more than once. That's just fine. But we just all, here we live, and what happens is we go up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And finally, Yogananda describes it perfectly in Autobiography of a Yogi. Pretty soon, it assumes a certain anguishing monotony. I just love those two words together, anguishing monotony. It's just like, here's another day. Before I came to the spiritual path, actually before I found Swami Kriyananda, who really grounded me. Ananda and Swami Kriyananda grounded me on this path. I really thought if I just spent one more day doing what I was doing, I would absolutely go out of my mind. And there wasn't anything happening in my life that was even slightly unpleasant. From the outside, it looked like I was a young woman just on her way, and everything was going so great. And internally, my consciousness was, oh my God, is this it? The next 60 years? Just get up, go to work, have an okay work day, come home, be with your friends, go to sleep, get up, go to work, spend a little time with your friends, go to work. I just like, oh no, there has to be more, please, please, please tell me there's more. Now you see, the good news is there is, there always has been. It's never moved away from us. The most remarkable thing about the spiritual path is that nothing is ever different than it is right now. That it's not as if, like on, next week, God will become present. It's not as if, like 30 years from now, after 30 years of Kriya, suddenly you will suddenly be somewhere that you're not already right now. The difference entirely and only is that we perceive it differently. Now here's the even more extraordinary thing, and this is what our reading is about today. It's not that we perceive it differently, it's that we receive it differently. All the time, we're not creating our own reality. Did you? I know philosophically we say you create your own reality, you're responsible, and in a certain sense it's true, but it's not necessarily the most helpful way to think about it, because the I that uses that sentence is not the right I. What really happens is we receive it. That there is a reality being broadcast at all times, emanating from the divine source. And it includes this dream. That's how Master puts it so clearly. The dream is true. Even the dream is true on the level of the dream. You know, when you're having a dream, it really happens, doesn't it? When you're asleep and then something is taking place. I have this occasionally recurring dream of making some really stupid decisions that completely wreck my life. Undoubtedly, it's a past life memory. And you know, every few months I'll have the dream, a dream that has me just making terrible choices, realizing I have just destroyed my whole life. And I usually realize it in the dream about a minute after I've committed myself in the wrong way. I become so upset, and then I wake up. And when I wake up, I'm so glad. Oh, thank you, Lord, for sparing me that experience. But I know it's in me because it was there in the past. At some point, it seemed like a good idea. But I've really impressed on my brain that it's not, but not quite. Because in my dream, I keep making that same mistake again. Because on the level of the dream, it's true. And it's just so depressing to me. But then I wake up. And then when I wake up, I said, no, that's not happening anymore. So we receive, through our senses, the impression that I am this body, and that what I'm experiencing through this body is all about me, and it concerns me, and the things that happen to me are relevant. And Master has that wonderful phrase, we make the mistake of thinking that everything that happens to us personally concerns us personally. I love that. Well, of course we think, because who am I? Ah, yes, there's the question, who am I? Because right in this moment, the infinite Spirit of God is completely present. Perfect bliss is completely present, but we're not receiving it because we're not in the habit of receiving it. We're just in the habit of feeling our bodies and thinking our thoughts and running along in this way and that way. And that's why Master writes, Master says, and Swami writes in this commentary, the most important thing is attunement. Because what you tune into is entirely and completely what we are. We are nothing but the vibrations of consciousness we choose to receive and express. And the only difference between us and a God-realized Master is he's attuned to the infinite, and we're still attuned to being hungry and thirsty and restless and lonely and angry and frustrated and afraid. But those are just programs that are coming out on the radio. And we just have the habit of having our dial set there. I heard a marvelous statement from Yogananda, put it this way, let me first say this, in Autobiography of a Yogi. Thoughts are universal, not individually rooted. Thoughts are not individual, but universal. It's a very interesting phrase because when the thought is happening in our own mind, we think it's our thought. But what Master is really trying to say is we but reflect states of consciousness. And all of spiritual practice is an effort to pull ourselves back from our habitual perceptions so that once we stop perceiving wrongly, we will realize what has always been going on. And that's the other aspect of the spiritual path. We don't create it. We merely perceive we merely stop ignoring it. That would be the only way I could say it. We stop ignoring it. We're so in the habit of looking outward and thinking about ourselves that we don't notice that when everything else stops, our true nature is bliss. That's what we do when we meditate. We try to stop everything else. We stop the restless feelings of the heart, the restless cravings of the mind, the restless fidgeting of the body, and then what we discover is what was always there. Now, attunement is also not just a lucky accident. It's a conscious decision we make. And this is what I was going to say. I heard a quotation from a disciple of Master, a woman named Durga Mata. She died in the 1970s. She was a very advanced disciple. She said, the first thought that comes to you, meaning a thought that's not helpful to you or doesn't take you in the direction of your true bliss, the first thought that comes to you is not your fault. Because they're out there floating around, and if you happen to stand in the right way and the thought of, oh, she's so much prettier than I'm not really worthwhile, am I? Or, oh, I guess I'll never succeed. Or, oh, isn't it wonderful? Everybody thinks I'm so classy. That really makes me important, doesn't it? The first thought is not your fault. You just were standing in the ray and it hit you. The second thought is your responsibility. Which is once the thought, you attune yourself, accidentally or by deliberate intention, to something other than the state of perfect bliss. That's, the first one is an accident, but after that, the practice of attunement is to say, no, I'm just not going to accept that. Because I am a branch of the infinite spirit. That's how Jesus put it. I am the vine and you are my branches. Well, no, what am I? Where did I come from? Where did my life come from? What is everlastingly real? Where does my bliss come from? What do I want to tune into? And it's a constant struggle. Every spiritual epic in the world is a war. The Bhagavad Gita is a war. It's a war between cousins, a fight to the death. The good people must absolutely annihilate the bad people. Ooh, we don't like that. That's not pleasant at all. The Ramayana is a war. All the great epics of time are a war. Jesus' life was a war that ended with him fighting against those souls and then being actually crucified in the end, but resurrected. And the Jews, Jewish history, as they say, every Jewish holiday is, they tried to kill us, they didn't succeed, let's eat. Okay? Jewish life is nothing but a war. You know, even in the Old Testament, it's like sometimes God was smiting the Jews and sometimes the Jews were smiting others, but smite is the biggest word in the Old Testament. Everybody's smiting somebody, you know, but it's not really about bodies smiting bodies. It's about our fighting within ourselves to not accept any of those other programs, but just to tune into the one single reality. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's the prayer of the Jews, and it's a great prayer. And in the Festival of Light, we amend the Jewish teaching that God's chosen people have always been those of every race and nation who with deep love chose thee. And then right after that in the festival, we stand up and we hold up the light, gaze upon this light as a symbol of God's love. And then together we say, with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my soul, and with all my strength, I choose thy love. I choose only thee. That's attunement. That is the choice. Make that choice. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and everything else that we seek will come to us. God bless you.